Hello everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. A very warm welcome to alumni, donors, students, staff and friends of the university around the world who have joined us in person and online for a timely discussion about the geopolitical risks and frictions facing humanity. My name is Bruce Mortimer. I'm your MC tonight. I'm the Senior Alumni Engagement Director at Monash. We are delighted that nearly 800 people have registered for this event. In addition to those who have joined us here in person at the Arts Centre in Melbourne, we have alumni from 39 countries across the globe joining us. We encourage you to join the conversation and send the panel your questions using the Q&A function. Please join me now in welcoming our host, Professor Margaret Gardner, President and Vice-Chancellor of Monash University.
Thank you, Bruce, and it is wonderful to be here. And I've got to say, as the second in this series of events, it's been just so exciting to see so many people talking, coming, being part of this event. Many of you in person, I can see you. I cannot obviously see the people who are online, but it is really heartening to see people being engaged with the university, engaged with the debates. So I want to acknowledge current and former members of the Monash University Council, and we do have a number of them there, and I can see you, previous Deputy Chancellor among others, members of Monash itself, and we've got a huge number of people who are staff, students. But what's most important here is the Monash alumni community, and it is large and diverse, and it's exciting to see all of you here. Let me also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional owners of this land, still currently unceded, on which we meet today. And also other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be here tonight or joining us on the online version of this particular event. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present. These are very important events. We've had, a particularly disruptive time, as we know, over the last 2 years, and it has been great to reconnect with many people, but in this case with members of the alumni community. And in this reconnection, we're actually talking to you in part about the ambitions of our new strategic plan, Impact 2030, which puts our purpose as being directed to taking our education and research and our engagement with others to providing an impact on 3 significant global challenges, of which one is geopolitical security. The global alumni community is very large and very diverse. It now includes more than 450,000 people across 169 countries. And we can be that precise because we can find most people now. We're actually really proud of the achievements and contributions of our alumni. And in these debates as we move around the world, and most recently I've been in the east coast of the United States with our alumni, and we had a panel on the previous topic, climate change, and you can see our alumni engaging, you can see what our alumni are doing in that sort of space, and the same will happen as we discuss geopolitical security and thriving communities. And what it shows you is what a positive difference Monash alumni are making in the world through the things they do, both in their careers, but also more generally in their life, because people have so many different ways that they contribute. So I can see people here that I recognised from last time, so thank you for coming back. First global challenge we discussed was climate change. This second is geopolitical security. They all sit as part of the way the university is thinking about its purpose in the strategic plan, which 2030 tells you is for the next decade. And that plan is about charting a path. Universities are all committed to doing as excellent education and research as they can. Monash is a very distinctive university because its education and research is also much more deeply and broadly international than is common. We have built a hugely enterprising engagement with industry and in the development of new ventures, both for social and for more commercial ends as well. We have stayed true to a notion that we are providing access and high quality education, and we are providing outcomes that will build on a diverse community and build its inclusion. And we continue to do that. You could assume, and we usually do, that universities are there to do good. I mean, nobody wants to say they're doing research for evil purposes. But the commitment in this strategic plan is that we will be clear about the purpose, that we will make a definite and intentional effort to engage with others to make an impact on what we think are three of the big global challenges: climate change, geopolitical security and thriving communities. And for those of you who are doing that little, oh, what about inequality? The truth about any significant challenge is that it will be felt in different ways dependent on levels and scale of inequality and disadvantage in societies. And so we see that we have to take that always into account when we're looking at those three challenges. So tonight we're looking at geopolitical security. It has probably been something that outside audiences with particular specialist interest has probably not taken people's attention as much in recent years as it has in these most recent years. It is the moment when people have understood that you cannot take geopolitical security for granted. Like everything, you can never assume in human relations that something is done, solved, fixed forever, and that we are a community that has to keep working at the betterment of our lives in all sorts of ways. So this on geopolitical security is going to be led, and I express my appreciation and thanks to Professor Sharon Pickering, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education and Senior Vice President at Monash, and to our panellists, of whose expertise you will hear and who are giving their time tonight, and we look forward to hearing their insights. We see at present a disruption to a series of established institutional orders which we probably thought were much more settled than they ever were across and within nations. So we are seeing challenges to what we thought were well understood mechanisms for international security. We are seeing conflicts that seem to have embedded themselves in serious divisions, whether they are national, ethnic, religious, that have the air of being seemingly intractable. We should never take conflict to be intractable, but there is often a commentary that makes you feel that. We are seeing different disruptions in the way relations are experienced, and the most obvious is in the way the digital has penetrated the nature of relations between people and affected the way we understand both what is happening in the world and the way, in fact, people are forming themselves into groups of opinion about various things and how that is playing into the world as we understand it. We feel perhaps particularly issues about trust in institutions and processes, a feeling that so important to the way we experience security and so much seeming to be more fragile than it was. We do see continuing inequalities that within nations and across nations exacerbate various forms of conflicts and add to insecurities. I don't have to, I think, rehearse for you the things that we have seen most recently with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We are seeing unfold before us something that I didn't think I'd ever see in that form, the way young women and students are reacting in Iran post the issues that have come up about the policing of the way women should present themselves in that society. We feel more vulnerable to cyber attacks, whether they are by state actors or not. As a university, we feel that our response to geopolitical security is, I'm sorry for Jackie, not to build the world's largest international relations department, but to actually work across the breadth and depth of the university, to work with others to think how might we think about new international solutions. They will depend on all sorts of things that we do, the way we educate our students for the future, because they will create that future, but also the research we do in partnership with others. We're doing quite a deal of work. In research, the Monash Centre for Gender, Peace and Security, which Professor True leads, is a world-leading centre building the research evidence to deliver peace and security on a global scale. The centre was most recently asked to prepare a brief for the United Nations meeting held in New York alongside the General Assembly and hosted by the Malala Fund. That brief was on women, peace and security in Afghanistan. They have been, as you can tell from the title, very concerned about the intersection between gender and peace and security and how that is experienced and shapes and is affected by a whole series of ways that countries work in the way they work internally and with one another. There is obviously a serious focus on the way civil society actors can protect and uphold women's rights and securities. In a time when cybersecurity breaches and disinformation are also part of that insecurity, Monash University's IP Observatory is a platform that monitors in real time the availability and quality of the internet at any location in the world during critical events, because they have come to observe that if something is going to happen, it goes black on the internet. And so this monitoring of internet usage is a really important way of understanding what is about to happen if someone is about to move in serious ways in terms of conflicts, but it also is an important monitoring in terms of what's happening around other events like elections and natural disasters. We have a virtual school at Monash that's concerned with addressing educational inequity and geopolitical security. We have generous support from the Invergowrie Foundation, and we have thousands of places that are booked to provide STEM education for disadvantaged girls and young women. That began in Victoria. In 2023, this program will support 80,000 places for primary and secondary school students. And we know that that investment in that education is more important outside Australia even than it is within. The Monash Virtual School has partnered with NGOs in a number of international conflict zones, such as Smartness Vita in Ukraine, to provide educational continuity for the many young people who are living in conflict zones. Led by Associate Professor Michael Phillips, more than 120 students and staff from Monash's Faculty of Education are participating in the delivery of education into the Ukraine. And one of the things we hope is that ability to project into the future the university's Global Immersion Guarantee, which is a guarantee from the university to its undergraduate students that they will have an opportunity to be immersed in another culture, another place than their own. A lot of those students are going into the Indo-Pacific, and we feel that experience, that understanding, that educational experience, so it's not just the telling, read that book, do that research, it's the being in those places and independently through their own agency finding their way in those places with obviously our assistance in programs, that will secure the peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. Because it is. There are many things that cause conflicts, but we all feel that things are better when people understand what the world is really like and who the people are that they are at this particular moment deciding is the other, not them. So we fully fund that immersive study experience. We take students to India, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, the Pacific, among other places, and that we feel is the basis for understanding, for relationships, for sustained networks across the region. It's, as to our knowledge, the only international program of such quality and scale, and just this month, 700 Monash students will begin just this month, only this month, will embark on their Global Immersion Guarantee experience. And we have a number of these experiences that take students, the United Nations, through various other discovery programs. There are many ways they are important to the young people who will lead us in future. We've contributed over time. There's plenty of you alumni who, well, more than 30 who are currently ambassadors and high commissioners around the world from Monash University, the majority of them in the Indo-Pacific. And we have academics across all faculties that are engaged in different ways in geopolitical security research, whether that is how you shape health, or whether you talk about energy security, or whether you talk about technology and security policy. So it's a big topic, geopolitical security, and nobody's going to suggest that Monash has the answer to every bit of it. It doesn't. Part of the discussion is which bits can we make most difference in, which bits can we make most contribution to. But it is an important challenge. Those global challenges are existential challenges, you might say, not just global challenges. And so what we can do to better understand, address and alleviate the effects of geopolitical security is really important. I hope you enjoyed the discussions that follow. I want to thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing what's said. I am now going to introduce the chair of the panel, Professor Sharon Pickering, who'll be moderating the panel. As I've already mentioned, Professor Pickering is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education and therefore indeed the senior executive that's responsible for delivering to the students the Global Immersion Guarantee, which is indeed a signal and wonderful experience. Her disciplinary background is as a Professor of Criminology, and she's been highly regarded as a global expert on border crossings, migration and trafficking. Professor Pickering worked in Northern Ireland on conflict and policing, across Southeast Asia with Amnesty International on human rights and women, led research on borders and all the things the things that we don't ever want to look at that happen on borders around the world, including Myanmar, the US-Mexico border, in the Mediterranean and in Australia. Our borders are slightly more watery than some, but equally important, and issues to be dealt with. She's an award-winning author. She's written 16 books. In 2012, she won the Australian Human Rights Award for print and online media on human rights and asylum. In 2020, she won the Australian Financial Review's International Education Award, indeed for the seeds of the Global Immersion Guarantee, which is now available to all students. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm being joined on stage by my two most excellent colleagues, so we'll just make ourselves comfortable while you all take a breath as well. It's really my pleasure to be here, and of course I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet here today, pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend those respects to Indigenous colleagues and friends joining us here in the room. Here to my left are two stunning Monash leaders in the field of geopolitical security, and we're incredibly fortunate that they're sharing their time and, most importantly, their experiences and observations with us this evening. Sasha Becker is the Zhao Kai Chair of Business and Economics at Monash University, and is also a part-time professor at the University of Warwick, one of Monash University's network of excellence and alliance partners in the UK. His research expertise sits across political economy, economic history and labour economics. Most interestingly for me, not that those areas are not terribly interesting, but most interesting to me is that this most excellent economist has turned his attention to forced migration, and that forced migration which is so often a consequence of geopolitical turmoil. So welcome, Sasha. Professor Jackie True, as you have heard, is the director of the phenomenal Monash Centre for Gender, Peace and Security, a centre which is less than a decade old but has quickly established itself as a global leader in the field. And I think, along with a small handful of other centres, is actually at the forefront of not only influencing the direction of the UN, but of so many national governments around the world as they finally come to grips with the reality that is the need for a feminist foreign policy. Professor True has authored so many important works, but most notably, she was recently named one of the 100 most influential people worldwide on gender policy. Please join me in welcoming Jackie. Let me begin with a straightforward question, if I may. But in doing so, I'd like to quote what the UN Secretary-General said to the world just a fortnight ago. And he said, and I quote, "We are gridlocked in colossal global dysfunction. The international community is not ready or willing to tackle the big dramatic challenges of our age. These crises threaten the very future of humanity and the fate of our planet. Our world is in peril and it is paralysed." So let me start by asking you, Jackie, what are the key features of this dysfunction? And why is the Secretary-General, of all people, with his line of sight and understanding, so certain that the international community is unwilling or perhaps unable to take action?
Okay, well, we can start with the big questions and hopefully it can get easier from there on. So, I would just quickly say what are the key dysfunctions. I'll quickly say something about that, and then let me just say why I think the Secretary-General has given that speech and what we can take from it. So the key features of the dysfunction, first of all, are hyper-masculine leadership, which is basically driving us to the brink. Dysfunctional authoritarian states that repress their own citizens, and thirdly, international institutions that are not fit for purpose, that do not reflect the current distribution of populations and power in the world that were in fact established after World War II by the victors, and that don't really reflect our world today. So those are the three key aspects of dysfunction. Now, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is saying, it's a call to action actually, and he is not confident that member states of the United Nations will actually address increasing conflict, not least of all Russia's invasion in Ukraine, but in other places too. Also, that they won't address, egregious human rights violations around the world, and that they won't avert climate change, because the last 2 decades have actually shown us, the real failure of collective action in the world. And I'm usually an optimist, but I have to say, I've got a long laundry list of failures to act on the part of our key institutions, our nation states. So, if I can maybe start with the internationalized conflict in Syria, which actually led to the European migration crisis, and which is really not resolved yet. I might also note, the belabored negotiations around Brexit, vis-a-vis probably the most significant international institution in the post-war period, the European Union. And then the rise of right-wing populist movements and governments, and now in the heartland of Europe. These are the states that you've relied on to kind of uphold an international rules-based liberal order. And on top of that, we also see, obviously during the previous American administration, the withdrawal from the nuclear treaty with Iran, with the US, the fallout of the talks with North Korea. So nothing is sticking. There's real limits to international cooperation. So, and then he's obviously concerned, we have these ongoing crises around natural disasters. The pandemic was not well managed. I mean, we might feel that was well managed in Australia, but it has not been well managed globally. We had just an attempt to have a global ceasefire on conflict during the early days of the pandemic. That was that was a total flop. No one put down their guns for COVID-19. COVID-19, which we were so concerned about here, was the least of people's worries in Afghanistan.
Jackie's touched on this, that the kinds of failures that she's talking about there were also echoed in that same speech by the Secretary General. And he also remarked, divides are growing deeper, inequalities are growing wider, and the challenges spreading further. And as Jackie noted, it's often those who are forced to move, unwilling or unable to be protected by their states, that they are displaced internally or indeed across national borders. Where have you seen the key causes and nature of that displacement going recently under the kind of that laundry list of failures that Jackie has outlined?
So the word inequality was used both by the Vice Chancellor and by Jackie before. I think often a cause of forced migration is inequalities between different ethnic or religious groups in countries that are then giving rise to conflicts, competition over resources, and often also hatred, pure hatred. And I've done a lot of research on anti-Semitism, for example, which was a key driver in over nearly 2,000 years of history of forced migration of Jews, as one example. But clearly also wars, international wars, are a source of forced migration. And we've seen that now in the Ukrainian context with 13, 14, 15 million of refugees, both domestically and internationally. And clearly, an additional factor in the last 2 years and going forward is climate change, where we will see more forced migration as a result of people no longer being able to live in the areas they are residing. So that's the causes side of things. When it comes to the consequences, I personally find it always helpful to think what are consequences. And on the one hand, it's consequences for the receiving end. Like, as Australians, maybe we are most concerned about what happens to us when all these refugees come our way. Then also to the extent that typically not everyone flees an area of conflict, you can ask what happens to those left behind where lots of refugees leave an area. And then ultimately what I personally think is often overlooked is what does the experience of forced migration do to the refugees themselves? And here, sometimes we have this idea that, okay, there are migrants, I'm a migrant, I came to Australia 3 years ago, but I was able to plan ahead. I browsed the internet, I talked to colleagues, I took 1 year to decide before I signed. And so I put a lot of effort into it. If you are a refugee and someone bombs your house and suddenly you have to flee a conflict zone, you have to go out right away. You have to leave behind everything. And you don't have that time to plan ahead. You didn't expect it at all. And what some of my own research in the past years has shown is, and it's called the Uprootedness Hypothesis. If you've been uprooted from the area where you were residing, either as a consequence of wars or climate change or natural disasters like volcano outbreaks, then you may generally want to rethink the life you lead. So if all your physical possessions are gone, people may redirect in the future their own efforts and that of their kids towards something that cannot be taken away from them. And what we found in our research is that people who were subject to forced migration after World War II, where borders changed in Europe, they are now much more keen to get an education for their kid, a higher education, because that's the one thing no one can take away from you, because you carry it with you. It's in your brain. No one can bomb that away. You have it with you. So I think we have to take also these things into account when we look at refugees. So when we welcome refugees, say in Australia, we also have to give them access to education and ASAP. And just to give an example of something that can go wrong, I'm German, as you might have heard by now. In Germany, in the Syrian refugee crisis, Germany was quite welcoming to refugees. Angela Merkel had this famous statement about, we can do it, wir schaffen das. Yeah? But still, then refugees would often be in refugee camps, in refugee housing. And there were cases where kids for 1 year didn't go to school at all, which is crazy, right? This is one of the richest countries in the world, and kids are sitting in a refugee housing and are not going to school. That's mad. Yeah, we can't do that. That's 1 year lost. Yeah. So we have to also take into account that experience, that harrowing experience that's both physical and psychological of having lost everything.
Look, thinking about the present-day impact of displacement on refugee kids, we have seen that in so many places around the world. And I guess in your reference to the war in the Ukraine, which has had such devastating consequences both locally and globally, it has prompted many observers to make observations around the hardening of our world, at least into 2, maybe 3 blocks. A Western bloc, perhaps a China-centric bloc, and perhaps some would describe potentially a 3rd bloc of some kind of constellation of African, Southeast Asian, South American nations. This hardening has consequences. Jackie, do you want to just reflect on what do you think those consequences are as those blocks of power and alliances start to firm?
Perhaps I might like to slightly contest that question, Sharon, in that I don't think it's actually helpful to think about hardening of geostrategic or political regions as the major dynamic. I think it's more helpful to think about polarisation, both within societies and between states. So definitely there is a contestation of Western hegemony. going on. And that is enabling some alliances between other regions. So one of the things that I was going to mention before I had a coughing fit
We didn't know this.
Okay, yes. Was that, I think that the most recent speech of President Putin, the annexation speech last weekend, really is an attempt not only to speak to the Russian public, but also to speak to those aggrieved states, especially in the global south, and to rally them into a new historic bloc that can really challenge what he would see as the hegemony of Western states, in particular the United States. So I think it's really important for us to actually listen to the contestations that are occurring, not just by other states, but also within our own publics, because we have our own kind of far-right groups, for example, in Australia, that would probably have been quite receptive to what Putin had to say. So, just let me say a few things that he said, and I really recommend to you all to read and think about that annexation speech on the weekend. And he said, the rules-based world order that the Western countries like to talk about is nonsense. He said, who made the rules? Who agrees with the rules? The West has no moral authority to challenge the referendums. They violate other countries' borders. They use nuclear weapons, creating a precedent. And he goes on to say other things, including things like, would we want a world where mum and dad become parent 1 and 2, and where, genders can transition? Would we want that for our children? So what he's doing is he's actually rallying insurgent movements, extremist movements, as well as other states around a certain kind of, anti-Western vision. And I think that is more concerning than this notion that there's going to be 3 kind of blocks. I think that's a state-based way of thinking. The more powerful challenge that we need to take seriously is the challenges that are coming from within our societies and that are connecting with those other forces, in countries like Russia, but also Turkey, definitely Iran and North Korea, and we can go on.
Yeah. I think considering that, Sasha, considering the ways that that the situation has been set up, whether you view it through Putin's eyes or as another observer, the way you see it, what are your expectations for what that will do to the future of forced migration?
So I think, I do economic history and I look back into the past as well as hoping to learn something for today. One thing is clear, the world has always gone through ups and downs, periods of more peace and periods that were more full of war. Say, looking back at 1990, the wall came down, the Iron Curtain fell, and I was young, 16, 17. I thought, wow, the world is becoming a better place. Yeah? How naive was I? Yeah? If you just look at the number of refugees in the world as an indicator, when I did this research some years ago that I previously mentioned, there were 65 million refugees around the world, both domestically and internationally. Now we are talking about 100 million, just in the course of 4 or 5 more years, and one major contributor was the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. Now, what can we do about this, or how can we prepare ourselves? It's often hard to predict where the next conflict will come from, but one thing is certain, there will be more conflicts in the future, and especially climate change will also be a thing that in our area here will be of high importance, because so many of the Pacific islands are low-lying, and with rising sea levels there will be trouble. Now, one thing we often overlook is, when it comes to refugees, we get into action gear once refugees arrive at our doorstep. Yeah? And we could probably do more to, A, prevent stuff from happening, and especially on the climate side. Let me give you an example. a research paper that a colleague wrote some years ago is about Vietnam. And you might know or not, Vietnam is one of the lowest lying countries, has lots of coastal areas that are very low lying. And if only sea levels rise by 1 meter, 5% of Vietnam will be inundated. Yeah? Now, where do people live? Well, they live on the coast. Yeah? Where does the government invest in infrastructure? Well, where people live. Yeah? So they are still building more roads in areas where we know in 30 or 40 years they are most likely to be flooded. Yeah? That is not forward-looking. And maybe we as in the international community are even giving foreign aid to help infrastructure investment, and there might not be these restrictions on, well, are you also forward-looking, like maybe you want to build that road like 5-10 kilometers inland as opposed to on the coastline. Yeah? So we can do more on these dimensions to be more preventive. Yeah.
So it's interesting you mentioned Vietnam. Let me bring it back, Jackie, some of your comments to our region. Ukraine has rightly taken our attention. The events that the Vice-Chancellor referenced in Afghanistan, and of course the events of the last fortnight in Iran rightly focus our attention. But could I get you to think about how you see this playing out in our region, in the Indo-Pacific region, in Australia's neighbourhood?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I think, first of all, I have to also say, and here I'm sort of channeling Jacinda Ardern a bit and what she said in her Lowy Institute speech, which is that analogies are a very powerful thing. They are social constructions, and there are certain self-fulfilling prophecies in using the Russia-Ukraine analogy to China-Taiwan. So I'm not going to go there, because I would say that there's no inevitable trajectory here. And that what we learn from Russia and Ukraine, there are a number of things that we can learn, right? And the thing we don't need to learn, that it's inevitable that China will try to take Taiwan. But to the contrary, with how things are going at the moment in that war, I think they'd be learning something quite different. But it is true that the Indo-Pacific region is really probably the most significant region in the world, and economic power has shifted here. And so that is actually unsettling the political relationships, okay? And that's actually the big structural story of our lifetimes. And I think the fact that you have the so-called great powers all in the US, Russia, China, all in this region, contesting, some of the key spaces, I think is very significant. But at the same time, I think that there's tremendous opportunity and tremendous, really positive cooperation that's occurring in this region. So, and I think that, I think that we can already see that in Australia. And we benefit from that as a multicultural society. And so we have an ability and a responsibility to shape the future of this region. And I guess, to loop back to my first point, and I wanted to go back to the SG, the Secretary General, and, say that we have a duty to act. And that's what he's saying. Wealthy nations like Australia have a duty to act. To support the vulnerable. And though might be vulnerable nations who are facing, rising sea levels, they might be nations that are experiencing the negative impacts of another country's conflict. And they might also be people within nations who are seeking to restore their fundamental human rights. So I think, we have all of these challenges in the region. We have got an intractable conflict in Myanmar, and we've got massive extraction and exploitation by China in that region. We have that dynamic occurring possibly in the Pacific Islands. I think that Afghanistan is very significant. In fact, it's probably more significant than Russia-Ukraine for this region. Because we were part of an international mission that made a 20-year effort to build a democratic state, but with military force primarily, and that didn't work, and we left, and it's worse. So we've got a lot of work to do. But I think in Australia, we have a huge opportunity to contribute to that. And I think that's the opportunity that Monash University could take up.
Well, why don't I then turn your mind immediately to how that is done? Because when we talk about geopolitical security and all the references and all our conversation largely so far this evening has really held geopolitical security in that traditional space, that of high politics, and more than high politics, of high security. I guess the question we've got to ask, and I think Afghanistan therefore prompts me to ask this then, is, well, who was at the table? Mm-hmm. And what difference does that make?
Mm-hmm. It makes a huge difference. And, just speaking to some of my research now, the research that we do shows that if you want legal mechanisms that can resolve conflict effectively and sustain peace, if you want them to work, then you've got to have genuine participation from women. You cannot have peace processes without them. And unfortunately, that is what we saw in Afghanistan. That's actually what we've seen in the negotiations in Russia and Ukraine as well. That's what we see in Myanmar. And what does that mean? That means there's a huge effort that we have to make to support and amplify and back women in those societies who are struggling within them. They are actually forces for change within the societies, but they don't have access to power. They're not at the decision-making table, but they are connected. And they have tremendous abilities to mobilise their societies. So supporting women's empowerment within these countries in diplomatic ways can actually have significant impact. And I think Iran is part of our region, and to look at Iran and to see those young women on the front lines of a protest that really is revolutionary in nature, but also to see that they're taking forward the same protests that their mothers engaged in 1979, and those were the longest sustained protests in that country. So we've got to back women as forces of change for democracy and for human rights, and that is something that we can do. And that's something we can do in universities, in civil societies, and in business, and all of the ways that we engage. And definitely we can try to influence and push our government to support that as well. They're already on board, but often they need us to connect them. It's so often over the last few years that Foreign Affairs would actually call me up and say, who do you know in Myanmar that I can talk to? I've been surprised. I thought our diplomats would know everyone, but they don't. They don't own all the relationships. So the relationships we can forge, the people-to-people cooperation we can forge, that is actually the foundation for greater stability in our region.
This is a really interesting discussion, because here we are talking about civil society, and here we are civil society. The university is civil society. Sasha, thinking about the role of refugees, resettled refugees who remain displaced and perhaps remain without a settled status, they are still playing big roles in society. They're playing increasing roles in civil society, not just here in Australia, but across our region. Where do you see them playing into what Jackie's talking about here? Different voices, different contributions.
So I think, similar to what you said, it's important to bring all sides of the table together and to give refugees a voice. The way many countries think about refugees is, let's wait for the conflict to be over and then they can go back home. But as we go through time of conflict, we often don't know how it ends. It's not clear, neither for us nor for the refugees, whether this is a temporary thing or a permanent thing. Let me take the border changes after World War II, which I've talked about earlier. Poland moved 300 kilometers west because Germany lost territory and the Soviet Union took part of Poland, and millions of people were resettled. When you read the accounts of the refugees from the 1940s, late 1940s, there was always this dream, one day we go back to eastern Poland, which today, by the way, is part of Ukraine. And equally, the Germans still had these organizations that thought, oh, one day we will go back to these ex-German territories. Yeah? So that influences people's decisions as well, because they may not always invest in their country of abode because they think it's only temporary. Yeah? So that is something where refugees need to be on board in order to express what they even think, what they believe is this temporary, whether they have a desire to go back. And that conversation is super important. Yeah.
So let's take a step back further then. Just before the last federal election, there was a series of debates at the National Press Club. One of those debates was between the then Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, and the then Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. When the Shadow Foreign Minister stepped up to give her address, she did not only begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which she was giving that address from, but she basically said that Australia would seek to centre First Nations people in their foreign policy, and that Australia couldn't go out into the geopolitical terrain, if you like, without having a stronger sense of who we are. What does this reference to First Nations foreign policy mean, and what relevance does it have for the way we contend with geopolitical security?
I think it's hugely important and transformative. You cannot go out into the world if you don't know who you are. And you particularly cannot go into the Indo-Pacific region, to the Pacific, to Southeast Asia, who've also experienced colonisation, if you are not seen to be addressing the effects of colonisation in your own country. So I think it's really fundamental, and I would just say very honestly, I happen to be a dual citizen of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. I'm very proud of that. And the connections between those countries, but I've always felt Australia could learn so much more from New Zealand with regard to centring Indigenous perspectives within their national life and their international relations. So for Australia to be able to have an Indigenous foreign policy, it's something very serious. It means Indigenous people, First Nations people in Australia should actually participate in diplomacy. They should represent us. They should be out there in the world. That is who we are, okay? That's part of us. So that's important, but we should also learn from how they engage, how they listen to others, how they express hospitality, how they build trust and deep relationships. Because that is going to be a foundation for us to build those deep relationships and that cooperation, especially right now in the Pacific Islands, because of the geopolitical insecurity we have there with the contestation of China and the US in that region. That Indigenous perspective and centredness, I think, could be transformative for Australia. And I think in that, Australia will also come into line with the way in which Aotearoa New Zealand also approaches the Pacific, and I think together we could actually have a much more secure region.
I'm just reminded here to let our online audience know, so those of you who are playing along at home, there are some online polling going on, and I encourage you to engage with that. So Sasha, let's turn our attention in this last part to universities in times of geopolitical insecurity, and specifically in times of conflict. The purging of universities, the targeting of scholars and students, what of course those of us in universities would like to regard as the community's best and brightest. Okay, that kind of targeting we have seen in many places. We've also seen universities used as safe havens during such conflicts. When you look back, what do you identify as some of those key points in that history of universities in times of conflict and indeed of countering it?
Yeah, so one research question I've worked on for a while with the team is on the persecution of Jewish academics under the Nazis. Yeah? So when Hitler came to power in 1933, one of the first laws the Nazis issued was to purge the civil service, and universities were a part of that, from any Jew. Yeah? That meant that 1,500 Jewish academics, who were world-class people, many of them, Albert Einstein and the likes, lost their jobs. Can you think about that? You fire Nobel Prize winners, yeah, just because they are Jews. Yeah? Now, these people all were looking for jobs elsewhere in the world at once. Yeah? And the problem at that time was many did make it out and did manage to emigrate, but also a large number were killed in the Holocaust because they left too late or didn't find job opportunities abroad. And in many cases, as they went to other countries, and one example that comes to mind is the University of Chicago, the university president there was keen to hire Jewish academics because they were world-class people, because before World War II, Germany was what the US is now, the kind of leading science nation. But the president was not allowed by the university board to hire many Jews, yeah, because there was anti-Semitism also in these circles. Yeah? And if you mentioned we have these issues also today, academics that try to flee from regimes or may have been fired. Turkey comes to mind, or other countries, even today in the 2010s, 20s. Do we have our doors open all the time? Not necessarily. Even back then, many universities wait, let me see the CV first, yeah? And is that person above our hiring standards, yeah? So do we always rise up to the challenge to give shelter to academics? We definitely should. It's so important. And the countries that did open their doors, the universities that did open their doors in that historic episode, they continue to thrive, yeah? And it would be silly not to be welcoming. Yeah.
So, Jackie, here's our chance. Monash is seriously looking at how we contribute to geopolitical security as a university. But as a university, how can universities around the world respond to situations of conflict, of geopolitical security now in the contemporary moment?
Yeah, the world has changed. It's not World War II. And we are so much more globalised. And as Margaret pointed out, Monash is already incredibly international. We have staff and students from all of these conflict-affected places that we're talking about. So we have a responsibility to them. But I do still think a fundamental role we must have is to be a beacon of light, like to nurture freedom of expression, intellectual thought, and that means to be a safe haven for those who have been excluded and targeted in their own countries. So, I just have to mention, I do think it's very significant that Karl Popper wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand during World War II. So, just speaking, what can happen in these, that book is probably one of the most significant books of the 20th century, right? It is actually the book that makes the argument for the liberal international order. So universities actually enabled him a safe haven. And, today we actually have also these key leaders, young leaders. We've taken in young leaders from Afghanistan into Monash, right? And whilst they're not the Karl Poppers, they might be. And so I think the safe haven is really, really important. But more than that, I think that we need to be able to showcase, how we can, promote diversity, and we can disagree with one another, but in ways that is respectful, and that, really shows, how it is done. And I think Australian universities in particular have a role here, because I think we live in a society where multiculturalism is by and large quite successful. And I think that we probably also need to, actually actively cultivate, the openness and the exchange and the partnerships with others in these situations. So I do think one has to be consistent, but I think that the university has a role to stand up for students and scholars in places where they don't have freedom of speech, and to look for ways that we can partner with them to support them. I think that's a moral responsibility, and that's what the Secretary-General is talking about. It's a duty to act. And we all can act in different ways, but this is one way we can act. And the world has changed because we already have the diasporas in our university and our communities that can help us connect. And that we don't know, as Sasha said, we don't know when those countries will change, when people can go back, or if they will go back. But we actually live in a global village. So it's not about going back there or there. We are all in it together. Like, this is one planet. So I think I think not all universities would have the leadership and the confidence to do this, but I think a university that has a global footprint does have a global responsibility.
Sasha, many would suggest, and I would be leading among them, that universities are some of the most significant non-state actors in any society. And we would also argue that education is probably one of the greatest exercises of soft power that you can point to in any country, region, indeed part of the world. What do you see as the role for education in promoting geopolitical security?
So I think let's look at all levels of education, undergraduates, master students, PhD students. It is our duty to teach them the truth, and often there is a debate about what is even the truth, and some politicians want us to make believe there is alternative truth. So it's about establishing facts. So I teach economics, I teach economic growth, amongst others. And often it's about getting the right statistics and challenging them. For instance, another thing we do at Monash in Soda Labs in the business school is that we use a lot of satellite data. And with satellite data, you can also, using nightlight intensity, try to double check whether these GDP figures are correct that some countries want us to make believe. And you may have seen an article in The Economist about that last week if you read that magazine. Now, we need to teach students to challenge facts and to double check them. And also, I think often we look at correlations. We see there seems to be some relationship, but we don't know what is the direction of causality, what is the ultimate cause of something. And students, we teach them to these methods to really make sense of the world. But also the global immersion guarantee. Some of my PhD students are somewhere in the audience here, and they are literally from 5 different countries: Italy, Azerbaijan, Malaysia, South Korea, and some of them are themselves ethnic minorities in their countries of origin. I learn so much from them when they tell me about their own experiences. And it's a mutual thing. As educators, we need to be open, we need to listen. It's not one way, it's not like just throwing material at them, but it's always a conversation. In that conversation, you can support them to thrive.
Yeah. Jackie, here in this room, we have got hundreds of most excellent Monash alumni. We have hundreds more online, and you'll be pleased to know that more than half of them agreed that when asked which factor fueling geopolitical insecurity they're most concerned about, half of the online audience said they're most concerned with hypermasculine leaders with nuclear weapons. Either of those things are troubling enough, but put the two together and we have a particularly difficult situation. But thinking about the Monash, the emerging members of the Monash alumni community, those students who are with us at the moment and that will join this community, that are here with us tonight in such fabulous number, and it's wonderful to have everyone here. What are they going to need? What are they going to need to go out and be the kinds of actors and leaders that you've both described here tonight?
Well, I definitely agree with what Sasha said about being able to decode untruths and challenge and critically analyse data. But I think we will need, and we are, I think, already nurturing graduates who will have more sophisticated and advanced people skills than any previous generation, and that they are, and it's not just about language, it's about understanding, and that they can already achieve that here in Melbourne at Monash University, engaging with their classmates from really different backgrounds and cultures. And I think being able to listen and understand the experiences and the histories and the cultures of different people, and to take those seriously and then to be able to collaborate, I think that's fundamental. And I would say, like I do, sort of think of this as a kind of like a story of human development and human moral development, is that, with that listening and that orientation to understanding the other, we will also have a much greater emotional acuity to be able to, be people who can resolve conflict. Who can sit with conflict, resolve conflict, and who can actually consider the kind of alternative governance structures and mechanisms that we need to work together. And I think that's a kind of a soft skill, but I actually think it's more important than the numbers skills in the end, and it's harder to achieve.
So we're about to turn to taking some questions from the audience here and for those at home. But while folks get their questions together, Sasha, I'm sure that people here joining us would like to hear what's next for your research on forced migration. What are you and your colleagues turning your mind to in terms of contributing to geopolitical security?
So on the one hand, I think going forward, I'm still studying historical conflicts, historical genocides, what leads to it, where is the tipping point from only a conflict and then the tipping point towards mass murder and really trying to eliminate a whole peoples. And another area I find very fascinating going forward is, again, looking at the Holocaust era, the righteous among the nations. Because even in these terrible times where millions of Jews were killed, also some of the best in humanity came out. People who would put their own life on the line to give shelter to Jews. And I think what I'm working on going forward is analyzing the universe of biographies of people that are denominated as righteous among the nations. And what were their motives to help? Sometimes there is relationships, sometimes it's really accidental. Someone knocks at your door and says, could you help me? You say, oh, sure. And then they say, oh, I'm a Jew, and you've said yes, so here you are. Yeah? And how does that happen? So what is it that drives people to be good?
That's great, Sasha. And Jackie, what's next for the Monash Centre for Gender, Peace and Security?
Mm-hmm. Well, somewhat related to what the Vice-Chancellor said with regard to, I think, even your colleagues looking at an early warning of when there's an internet blackout, you know that something's happening. We have been looking at incidents of sexual and gender-based violence as lead indicators for the likelihood of more generalised conflict across a range of 7 or 8 cases globally. And we have some hypotheses based on a study of Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. And so I think that's really important because we are seeing many of these conflicts where the targeting in particular, particularly of young women, is becoming part of a dynamic that's fueling conflict and violence. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at, and we have been researching for a number of years, looking at, the factors that lead people to join violent groups, and for those groups to become more popular. And we've looked at Islamist groups, we've looked at far-right groups, and we've found that misogynistic attitudes toward women are a major driving factor. And now we're looking in a project funded by the US State Department. We're looking at Buddhist protectionism in our region, and we're looking at the ways in which, the extent to which, the roles of women within Buddhism and the misogynistic attitudes there may also be reinforcing that hyper-masculine leadership without nuclear weapons, but equally concerning.
That's great. I think our 2 panellists have held up to some intense questioning there. Please join me with a round of applause.
Thank you, Professors Pickering, True and Becker, for sharing your expertise and deep insights. It's given us a lot to think about as we consider the disruption that is occurring to established international orders across and within nations. That concludes the formalities. Many thanks for your attendance. We hope the discussion leaves you feeling even more informed about geopolitical security and the role that Monash University is playing to address this critical challenge of the age. Monash will continue to strive towards creating new international solutions through truly collaborative education and research. The next event in the Challenge of the Age event series will be on another key global issue, creating thriving communities. It will be online and also in person at our new Monash College building in Docklands at the end of Collins Street on November 24. We encourage you to register as places will be limited. The 2022 Monash Alumni Survey opened just over a week ago. More than 7,500 alumni have already shared how they feel about Monash and what they would like from the alumni program in the future. If you've not yet had a moment to share your thoughts, please do click on the link in the invitation email. We'd be really grateful for your feedback. For those of you with us in person, drinks and canapes will now be served in the pre-function area behind me, which means I'm actually between you and a drink. Please enjoy this opportunity to network with your fellow alumni and have a chat about tonight's discussion. If you're online, please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.